The tune of Jesus is still beautiful, even if Christians have sung out of tune.
The most important thing that we can do is to make the gospel credible, attractive, show ourselves totally committed to it.
You have Jesus praying for our unity as a testimony that he is God's son, right? The way that we love greatly one another in the church is a testimony. And it seems like we don't take that very seriously.
I don't think the church was ever expected to be a comfortable place, because Christians are cross-bearing people. And sometimes the biggest cross we have is from our fellow Christians.
The church is going to have a measure of unhealth. It is the devoting of ourselves that makes us healthy.
Satan hates the church. Satan is trying to destroy the church. Satan does not want you to go to church.
The posture of repair attunes the church to its need to minister and preserve a society on the verge of breaking down.
We are seeing really a generation trying to answer enormous existential questions of who am I? What does it mean to be human? What is my purpose in life? Why am I here? With little more than their feelings.
If the principal purpose why you assemble with your fellow Christians is to worship God, then worship God.
The question I would have for us is, why don't we believe that this book that we're staking our lives on is worthy of raising the bar? Discipline is not dead. It just follows the most compelling message.
The church waxes and wanes. That's the other perspective. You need a global perspective and a historical perspective, and it does help.
For 2 seasons now, we've looked at the credibility crisis facing the church today and some of the challenges that stand in the way of our attempts to renew and restore the church's witness. We've heard guest after guest give us truth and point us toward hope. We've talked about rolling up our sleeves and finding our place on the wall, doing whatever we can for the church, to reconstruct, to rebuild, to restore, to renew. But what if we can't rebuild? After all we've gleaned from Scripture, from church history, from the church around the world, that's the question that haunts me. What if we're not up to the task of rebuilding the witness of the church? What if we're not ready? What if, in spite of all of our good intentions, we're not capable of doing what's necessary to help the body of Christ grow healthier? No one expects a person who's never run before to succeed at a marathon. You don't expect someone who's not done a pull-up in years to do 10 out of the blue. You don't expect someone who never reads a book to sit in a professor's chair. You don't expect a Mozart sonata to come out of a 12-year-old at the piano, still practicing her scales. So that's why the question, what if we can't rebuild, is one I continue to ponder. If we have pockets full of good intentions, but desires don't bring about change? And what if all our hopes and dreams for a healthier church are bound to be dashed because we aren't healthy ourselves? Because we aren't well enough ourselves to help those around us who are ailing? Because we lack the necessary strength? Because we've not exercised the right muscles? Or, most crucially, we've yet to learn to abide in Christ and depend on the Spirit for the power necessary to bring about renewal. I'm Trevin Wax, Vice President of Resources and Marketing at the North American Mission Board. You're listening to Reconstructing Faith. In this series, we address different challenges facing the church today, offering perspective from church history and the global church, so that we are formed by the Spirit and strengthened for the tasks that lie ahead. I hope you'll join me on this journey and consider what you can contribute to the restoration and renewal of the witness of the people of God. This is the first episode of Season 3. What if we can't rebuild?
What's happened to our country?
This is the trailer for Terrence Malick's A Hidden Life, an acclaimed film from 2019 that depicts the life of Franz Jägerstätter, an Austrian farmer and devout Christian who refused to fight for the Nazis in World War II.
What does one do? You have a duty to the fatherland. The church tells you so.
You cannot say no. to your race and your home. You are a traitor.
I can't swear loyalty to Hitler. I can't.
Do you think your defiance will change the course of things?
I can't do what I believe is wrong.
A Hidden Life exposes great evil and injustice against the beautiful backdrop of the Austrian countryside, tracing the true story of Franz and his family, standing in the field, hands in the dirt, the sound of war drums in the distance. Franz questioned the morality of the war and refused to take the Hitler oath. As the situation around him grew ever darker, he issued a series of questions to church leaders complicit in Germany's atrocities.
How can we still educate our children to become true Catholics today, when we're supposed to teach them that some of the activities we previously considered seriously sinful are now good, or at least not so sinful? Who can succeed in simultaneously being a soldier of Christ and also soldier for National Socialism, in simultaneously fighting for the victory of Christ in His Church and also fighting for the victory of National Socialism?
At age 36, Franz was sent to the guillotine and was beheaded. Malick's film is a work of art that shines the light of conviction into the darkness of compromise, holding up the courage of Franz when cowardice was everywhere, even in the church. The film's title comes from Colossians 3:3, "For you died, and now your life is hidden with Christ in God," and from a line in George Eliot's Middlemarch.
For the growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs.
I'm inspired by the examples of men and women of faith who stood up and counted the cost of faithfulness in times of darkness. From ancient martyrs Perpetua and Felicity facing the beasts in the Roman amphitheater, to recent times, men like Dietrich Bonhoeffer in 1945 or Janani Luwum in Uganda in 1977. But as much as I've looked up to Christians who paid the ultimate price for faithfulness, and as much as I've enjoyed documentaries and movies about men like Franz Jägerstätter, when the credits roll, I'm left with a burning question. How is a person like that made? Do you ever wonder that? Do you ever ask yourself what goes into the making of a disciple so that when the moment of testing comes, the follower of Jesus is well-formed, well-prepared to display courage, to maintain honor? Yes, it's true the Holy Spirit gives grace and may flood a martyr's heart with peace and conviction when the time of testing arrives. But even then, the Spirit is working through a person's earlier formation, not overriding it. Thankfully, most of us will never face the kind of life or death choice we see in the stories of the martyrs. But the question is valid for other acts of obedience and faithfulness, including reconstruction, the hard work of repair. How can we be formed by the Spirit into men and women who renew the witness of the church and offer the world a clearer testimony to Christ? How is a rebuilder made?
But one thing I just noticed was that I think we didn't have a robust missiology of our own culture.
This is Mark Sayers, a church leader in Melbourne, Australia, and author of multiple books, including Disappearing Church and A Non-Anxious Presence. He offers astute cultural commentary on the church and spiritual renewal in his Rebuilders podcast. I asked Mark about his experience in the missional movement of the 1990s because I'd heard him talk about how often Christians were sent out to engage with people in society, but were ill-equipped to deal with the challenges that followed.
The science of missiology is really how do you communicate the gospel across cultural lines? How do you do that in a way which obviously doesn't water down the gospel, but also is culturally conversant? And I think there's a lot of reflection and research around how we do that in contexts that are not ours and often outside the West. What a lot of people missed was how much the West had become a post or almost pre-Christian culture in lots of places. And when that missional move was made without an understanding of that, What it meant was that we could be affected. So one thing I say is the study of missiology was something which was designed to prevent people from bringing the gospel but colonizing others, but not realizing the power of Western culture to colonize us as well.
Some people might have said, well, you didn't do enough worldview formation beforehand. Or we'll ask the question, well, what were you missing in order to not be able to be that effective missionary, to be able to go in and make inroads in the culture and rather being colonized? You didn't know the right things. You didn't know enough. I think a lot of people immediately assume, oh, it's a worldview problem. It's a cognition problem.
I'd say that's partially it. I've spent a lot of time talking about ideas and ideology and how do we do really well from a biblical perspective. But I think also what people missed is we were moving almost into a new phase of, I wouldn't just say Western culture, but global culture, one which was less rational. My dad wasn't in full-time ministry, but he worked at a university in the city in a building construction school and did ministry in his spare time. And a lot of the conversations, this would have been the 60s and 70s, was around ideas. And so people would make decisions. Am I a Marxist? Am I Hindu? Am I Christian? Whereas I think what we missed was that how the world, and particularly consumer culture, as it developed, it was seductive. And it didn't seduce you necessarily with ideas. It seduced you with patterns and desires and these things. And this is really powerful. And in a sense, I don't think we necessarily were prepared for this. The whole culture is not prepared for it. You've got books now looking at the addictive nature of digital media. As the world was being seduced, as you see the effects of mental health crisis in the culture, I don't think we were prepared for this. So just doing worldview stuff and intellectual work and cognitive work, which I think is really important, it didn't prepare us for how the culture was changing.
How would you describe the season that we've been in? I'm speaking particularly about the church in the West, with the exposing of so much rot and corruption. I mean, everything from the sex abuse scandals in many denominations, leadership toxicity, all kinds of things that have grown up around that. What do you think have been the biggest revelations in the past 20 years that have led us to this point where the church is in something of a credibility crisis?
I think the most important thing to realize is this is not a church phenomenon. And this company is being exposed, that sporting organization, that local government, that's happening everywhere. So I think what's happened is there are changes politically, socially, culturally, and in the media landscape, which has meant that things are a lot easier to be exposed at this time. The corollary to that as well is it's also going to be a lot harder to build things going forward because there's sort of this constant ability to point out things which are negative, and it makes it a lot harder to build consensus going forward. So there's a good and a bad side.
If you were to mention just a few of the big rocks that are in the way that are obstacles to us rebuilding, us pursuing renewal of the church, trust within the church as well, what would those be?
Unfortunately, we're going through a massive decline in trust. And that's happening across the society, which means you don't trust your neighbor. Also, greater complexity in the world means trust also goes down because you don't have a common language to deal with others. So one thing that is really, really difficult is trust is massively in decline. People go, well, okay, so the answer then is I've got to then just be a super trustworthy person. And is that part of the answer? Yes. And by following Jesus and trying to be Christ-like and humble, 100%, assume trust isn't going to work anymore. But the difficult thing as well is because power is sort of jumped outside of its usual boundaries at the moment. So a small group with the internet and complaints and undermining of leadership is so much more powerful now than it was in the past. The thing that's really difficult is there's going to be moments where that's legitimate, where genuine corrupt behavior is exposed, but other times where that is going to be used, as it has throughout church history, of politicking and undermining and so on. It's going to be much harder to build at the moment. I think that the next renewal that's going to happen has to be one which finds a way to rebuild trust in a world where trust can be rapidly undermined, and also needs to be something where it rebuilds social capacity. You can have the great vision, but those two things are not in place.
In 2024, an insightful report on trust was released within the Church of England. The authors lean on a definition of trust from a 1998 journal article. Trust is the intention to accept vulnerability based on positive expectations of the intentions or behaviors of another. This definition covers a wide range of institutional life and helps us understand why breaking trust is so damaging. To trust someone else requires us to accept vulnerability. It's possible we're wrong about the person we trust. We might get hurt. And yet, this vulnerability is indispensable to a properly functioning society.
No higher order activity can proceed without the presumption of trust.
This is best-selling author and popular podcaster Malcolm Gladwell on a podcast in 2019. In his book, Talking to Strangers, Malcolm Gladwell says, our initial response when something seems amiss is to default to truth.
So if I trusted that the address you people gave me was correct, I trusted you would be here, I trusted that you would prepare for this interview, there's a million things. You trusted I would show up and that I would speak to you in good faith. I mean, because each of us made enormous, I have, never met you before, nor have you ever met me. But this works because each of us made 10 assumptions, positive assumptions about the other party, right? Before we even started.
Mm-hmm.
And if we were the kinds of people who thought twice about those presumptions, then this would have never happened, right? So society, and I always give the example of, you can't put your child on a school bus in the morning unless you have implicit trust in the system.
Gladwell shows that most everyone has this presumption to trust. We inherently trust people, technology, and institutions. Sometimes this impulse goes wrong and leads to tragic outcomes when we refuse to see, or are unable to see, the corruption or injustice taking place right before our eyes. But defaulting to distrust would be even worse. Our world would grind to a halt, and life would be impossible if all trust were absent.
In numerous situations, what is the effective leader in an organization? The kind of person who is willing to believe in their employees, to help them, mentor them, nurture them, encourage them. All of those things are based on a fundamental trust that the employee will respond accordingly, that the employee is as dedicated and motivated about the work as the manager wants them to be. I mean, that could go on. You can't do anything.
We can't not trust people and institutions, at least at some level, which is why it matters that people and institutions work hard to build and retain trust, especially when, as the old Dutch proverb goes, trust comes on foot, but leaves on horseback. The Church of England's report on trust lays out 4 essential elements for healthy and trustworthy leaders in an organization. First, ability. Have they got the right competencies and abilities to do their job? Secondly, benevolence. Are they bothered about others or entirely self-interested? Third, integrity. Are they guided in their decisions and actions by a moral code? Fourth, predictability. Can people see a consistency in their approach? In my experience, all 4 of these ingredients are crucial, but they're not equally important. Leaders can be forgiven occasional lapses in the first category, ability, because no one expects everyone to be fully competent at all times in all ways. In fact, a leader's response, if he or she acknowledges mistakes, corrects problems, and shows growth in competency, can serve to increase trustworthiness over time. Likewise, the 4th category, predictability, that's important, but erratic behavior can be overcome if the other 3 elements are in place, and the leader demonstrates the desire for consistency. The 2nd and 3rd categories are most critical: benevolence and integrity. The moment an institution acts in cravenly self-focused ways, or a leader makes decisions that betray selfish ambition instead of a servant's heart, or people cross clear moral lines to preserve and protect reputation or power, trust dissipates. An organization can survive challenges and failures in categories 1 and 4, ability and predictability, but it's much more difficult to recover and rebuild trust when malevolence and dishonesty become obvious. And that's the situation we're facing today. Because in some churches, we've seen massive breaches of trust in categories 2 and 3, failures in benevolence and integrity. And that makes it all the more difficult for other churches to overcome even minor lapses in categories 1 and 4, ability and predictability. People are more likely to interpret run-of-the-mill deficiencies in competency and predictability as if they were the more egregious breaches of trust and benevolence and integrity. In this atmosphere, common mistakes can suddenly have outsized effects. The cloud of suspicion hangs over all churches everywhere, even those doing a good job of maintaining consistently high standards of accountability and trust. This is one of the most pressing questions of our day. How do we rebuild a culture of trust in this environment? We can't change the cultural winds, but can we become a sturdy tree in the midst of the storm? How do we become people who not only trust others, but are trustworthy ourselves? How do we become part of the solution? We'll be right back.
Great is thy faithfulness. Great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto
Trust is at the core of Christianity. We're people of belief, trust, faith, and faithfulness. We seek to be faithful reflections of the God whose faithfulness is great. As Christians, we're marked out by specific beliefs. We confess Jesus Christ crucified and risen from the dead. We're marked out by a life built on trust. We rely on Christ alone for salvation. We're marked out by a life of walking by faith, not by sight. Faithfulness to God and to his people becomes a defining element of our lives. A crucial aspect of living a faithful Christian life is our growth toward ever greater trust in God and a corresponding growth in becoming more trustworthy ourselves. Truly trustworthy people don't just stumble into trustworthiness. They've done, and keep doing, the hard work of surrendering every part of their lives to God, heart, mind, soul, and strength. They bring even the uncomfortable emotions, wounded places, and hidden struggles into the light, trusting that God designed us as whole beings with every part working together. Trustworthiness isn't just about right beliefs or godly behavior. It includes the emotional, relational, physical, and even sexual aspects of our lives, shaped by the stories we've lived. And it's a lifelong process, empowered by the Spirit. When someone acts radically out of character, it's often because they've buried something unresolved, something shaping their beliefs and behaviors in ways they don't fully see. Self-awareness isn't an end in itself, but we can't surrender what we can't name. Honesty with God about our inner and outer realities is where trustworthiness begins. As people of belief, trust, faith, and faithfulness, we're uniquely equipped to contribute to the repairing and rebuilding of institutional credibility. This is one way we fulfill our role as salt and light. So how do we lead in this time? I wanted to get Mark Sayers' take on this question. How do you counsel the church leader who wants their church to be an oasis in this kind of chaotic world, and they do want their church to be a place where social capacity is on the increase and trust is slowly but surely rebuilt, to where people come in and they're almost taken aback by the fact that there is social capacity here. There are interpersonal relationships that are healthy and strong and growing, and where trust between people is good. How do you encourage leaders in this environment when their own leadership is going to be contested?
A few things. This is such a great question. I think this is the ball game here. I think the first thing is there was almost a sort of political moment, cultural moment, where we had focus groups where if you just go out and do the right polling, you can craft the right message and it'll appeal to the mass. That's gone. So if you want to be the pleasant, middle of the road kind of leader who doesn't offend anyone, that's now impossible. Firstly, I think leaders have to get their mind around that they're going to be unpopular, number one. Number two, when they do come to that realization, you can then not get seduced by the negative benefits or incentives of a social media age. Because as once you go, well, I'm not going to be unpopular, you can then get seduced, particularly to extremes of the left and right, or even increasingly extreme centrism, where you'll then find a new tribe and there's a process where it just drives you further into extremes. Not driven by the gospel, not driven by biblical vision, but further into extremes.
You're basically saying that once you come to the realization you're not going to be popular, you're going to be unpopular with some, you can choose carefully who you want to be unpopular with, which will increase your popularity with people that already are negatively polarized against that group. And so that leads to further extremism because it's a self-reinforcing loop at that point. Am I hearing you right?
Yes, 100%. So I often say this, your enemies may destroy you, but your allies can seduce you. You're not going to like the person who, let's just say, is deeply in fear of becoming a Marxist is highly unlikely they're going to wake up tomorrow and go, oh my goodness, I'm a Stalinist now. The danger is that they're going to drift further into the excesses of the right because the people who are the enemy of their enemy are more likely to seduce you. So the danger is that once we go, okay, well, people are not going to like me, and those people are throwing bricks at me. Who else is getting thrown bricks at by those people? I want to hang out with them there because there's some solace there. But then before you know it, you're in a very vulnerable position. So that sort of gospel critique of culture, which comes against every culture, all of a sudden is turned off for one group. That always needs to be constantly going. Just as like all humans are fallen, all human systems are fallen, and come under the judgment of Christ. So the danger is because once we make that decision, like I'm unpopular, there's a real danger that you then get driven in. And you see this. You see people who seemed reasonable 6 years ago, and all of a sudden, like, what on earth happened? So there's a process. Point number 3 is, I think we need to change our metrics. I think our metrics of success have been large amounts of butts on seats, large digital footprint. These are the things. Platform, as you described it. And I posit an alternate, because actually a platform is a structure that is created. The ancient Greeks created the stage as a structure to elevate someone. In Scripture, in Revelation, there's this promise that at the end of the age will be made into pillars in the living temple. So again, to think about this idea of pillars. When someone who passes away and they've lived a life which is for others and a life which has created space for others to flourish, they're often described as a pillar of the community. And I thought about this. Pillars don't work in isolation. It's not about the singular heroic leader. A pillar architecturally needs to work with other pillars, but they have strength. They connect heaven to earth. They create space for things to flourish. And there's the beautiful biblical metaphor that the temple in Jerusalem is not coming back, that people of God are being built into a living temple, and the presence of God is amongst us. So I think there needs to be a significant paradigm shift. You may not get the recognition and metrics success that you thought, but it's a slow work, but it's a building work, doing that with others. And I think that there is a remnant, a cohort of people out there who are ready to build. I'm finding that. And in chats with people across the place, visiting churches that I haven't been at for a couple of years, have gone through the testing of COVID and everything that came afterwards, you see, oh, hang on, the people who are now flourishing are not the people they thought that they were, but it's almost like the central gathering point is around Christ and his mission. And a lot of the other dross has been sort of blown away. So I think that find the new central gathering point and then live that out, and people will be drawn to that. And I think also just believing that, yeah, it's hard, but there's an element that Christ has always built his church in tough seasons. It happened during world wars. It happened during Great Depressions. It happened during great plagues in the Middle Ages. Christ it's still his work, and he's doing it, and we're partnering with him in that.
How do we ensure that we're cultivating that across different congregations? Because that's a job for everyone. That's not just pastors that do that. That's a job for the whole body together to be edifying and strengthening and leaning on each other in support.
I think it requires a significant cultural change. And it's a significant cultural change of what we value. What I've noticed as I've thought about this, it's not always the people with positional leadership or even social pull that are pillars, but there's something about this, seeing our lives. We've had this very immanentized view of our lives, that here's my life, when I think scripturally we're part of a great chain. That there's the great witness throughout history. When you start to see yourself as, I'm part of that, so partially what I'm building may not even benefit me. Like, it's not just I'm building this life narrative for myself. And it's really struck with me that whilst not everyone may be able to build a great institution, anyone can live in a way where the things that they're doing benefit the generation and the generation to come after that. And you see that all through the Old Testament, the passing of the knowledge of God down through the generations. And so I think when you start to think in these ways, it changes how you view things. And when I read the biographies of the great men and women of God of the past, there's something really different about them. There's something, and they live in this different way where they're not trying to build a brand or a platform. There are pillars, and the fact that you're still reading these people generations later, I think it's having a focus that, it may not even, I may be fairly unknown in this life, but what if the seeds that are planted in partnership with Jesus last generations? It's those sort of mind shifts I think we need to integrate. The worse things get, there is an element that people do turn to God. When everything's wonderful, you don't have to worry about the news, you're buying anything you want, that God-shaped hole can often be covered with very material things. So in the midst of the chaos, there's an opportunity. It's just key that we don't lose our minds in this.
It just seems like, because of the individualistic age that we live in, the negative polarization, the isolation that's there, the digital ecosystem, relationships are breaking down all over the place. Because of that, it gets harder to make and sustain deep friendships, because it becomes a death spiral almost, where fewer and fewer people even really know what goes into making a good friendship or could model that or show other people that. So in a Christian context, obviously, that loss of friendship exacerbates the leadership crisis, because then you have leaders who are lonely, that are not in supportive, good friendships themselves. Help us understand the source of some of this crisis in relationships and how the church could push back and really be a counterculture in that environment.
I'd almost put three pillars here. I think that we're seeing the almost fall over of individualism. And I do actually have starting to wonder we're coming to the end of individualism. Now, this has been driven by two things. One is the digital reality, I think, is solvent that is corroding relationships. Mark Fisher, the English writer, talks about, if you compare the movie The Godfather to the movie Heat, this massive change has happened. Godfather was done in the 70s. It's Italian-American families, but really it's a movie about relationships. A lot of the scenes are done around food. It's about this strong Italian-American community. There are links to New York, there are links back to Sicily, and it's all about betrayals and family dynamics.
You spend time with your family?
Sure I do.
Good. Because a man who doesn't spend time with his family can never be a real man. Come here.
But then Heat is another crime movie. It's done in the 90s, before social media, before the internet really taken off. And it's these very isolated individuals on this very lonely Los Angeles landscape. And so there was already this problem of hyper-individualism. And Fisher said that in The Godfather, the language is don't go against the family. In Heat, they talk about business. The criminal is an entrepreneur. The crews, they don't know each other, and they don't want to know each other, so they can walk away. So the whole thing in Heat is Neil McCauley, who's the character played by Robert De Niro, says, if the heat or the police are on you, you need to be able to walk away from anything in your life in 30 seconds. So what the movie's saying is, by the 90s, the mantra was, if you want to be successful in contemporary American culture and economy, you need to be able to walk out on anything in 30 seconds.
Guy told me one time, don't let yourself get attached to anything you are not willing to walk out on in 30 seconds flat if you feel the heat around the corner. Now, if you're around me and you got to move when I move, how do you expect to keep a a marriage.
Well, that's an interesting point.
I think we're at this moment, similar to what happened in the 30s, when you had another moment of atomization and then mass political movements came in. I think we're at a moment where it is utterly, utterly imperative, not just because, hey, it's a nice thing to do and people are lonely. What the church does is, we do potluck dinners. We do small groups. We do, hey, 10 of us are going to watch the football. Do you want to come along? Hey, we're chatting. Our bread and butter is human relationships. Compared to the massive buildings of the Roman Empire, the early church must have looked pretty darn unimpressive, right? And I think that's what it can feel like at the moment. Compared to Google, your church of 80 people somewhere in Middle America may feel utterly insignificant, but I think that social capital people are so hungry for. I think that there is a tremendous cultural hunger, and socially. I mean, South Korea has like a government department because it's becoming utterly atomized as a culture. And also to the fertility crisis is part of this. Like, this is now an existential crisis for not just Western societies, but many societies around the world. So I think there is a massive untapped oil field here of resources for the church to get back to bread and butter. And anyone can do this. Anyone can learn to be a friend. There's a danger that in the midst of this, in response to some of the scandals and crises, like really tragedy that we've gone through with that, is relationships become so professionalized that there's no space for friendships. The pastor just becomes like the psychiatrist. Here's the billable hour and I'm out. There's a danger that there's a reaction the opposite way. There is a messiness in the world of relationships that's never clean cut, and there's an organic nature to them which resist categorization by the market, if that makes sense. So I think that there is this massive potential that just ordinary Christians can get behind to build relationships, but we have to do it. We almost have to go counterculturally to those massive forces working against us.
To stand against these massive forces working against us, we'll need to be more like sturdy trees than a tumbleweed that blows in the wind. We'll have to be solid, people of substance. C.S. Lewis's classic book, The Great Divorce, paints a dreamlike picture of the afterlife through a series of encounters with people just outside of heaven. Lewis imagines the solid people, who are already enjoying heaven's glories, in contrast to the ghosts, who inhabit a purgatorial realm. The ghosts, in their current state, cannot take in heaven's light. They're shadows of humanity, transparent and superficial, in contrast to what's solid and substantive in the high countries. In Lewis's vision, the solid people are stand-ins for true humanity, what God has always intended us to become. They are solid because they are selfless. The ghosts are shadows because they cannot see past themselves. In reflecting on the Great Divorce, I'm struck by the question of whether we as people are growing more and more selflessly solid or becoming more and more selfishly shadowy. We live in an era tailor-made for superficiality, for ghost-like transparency. Day after day, we scroll through endless updates, follow all the latest political controversies on social media, jump to games on our smartphones, chuckle at sitcoms or the latest YouTube short. The currents of culture tug at us until slowly, almost imperceptibly, we lose the capacity to stand in awe of God, to feel the weight of glory, and to encounter profound and eternal truths. Everything is pushing us towards superficiality, toward the banalities of entertainment, or the rush of breaking news. There's no cultural push toward wisdom and reflection, toward those activities and practices that would make us more substantial, more solid. But substance matters in a world of shadows. Are we people of substance in a world of ghosts? Or are we as wispy and shallow as the rest of the world? Are we too compromised, too complacent, too dedicated to trivialities, so that our undeveloped spiritual muscles keep us in a posture of timidity, insecurity, and apathy? The task of rebuilding institutional trust will be impossible apart from us becoming trustworthy ourselves. People who are steadfast, sturdy, like the tree of Psalm 1, planted beside flowing streams, that bears its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. People who are reliable, people who are dependable, people of trust in a world of lies and deception. Or, as Mark Sayers said, pillars. And maybe that's what we should be asking. Not how do we rebuild the walls, but how do we become pillars? We'll be right back.
So sit down and write that letter. Sign up and join the fight. Sink into all that matters. Step out into the light. Let go of all that's passing. Lift up the least of these. Lean into something lasting. Planting trees.
It's strange, but the more I reflect on the pressing question, what if we can't rebuild? The less I'm haunted and the more I'm hopeful. Because the more I consider the challenges ahead for the church and the difficulty of God's people becoming pillars in a world marked by breakdown and ruins, the more I realize the answer to the question, are we strong enough to rebuild? Are we capable? Is no, we are not. We are not strong enough to restore the witness of the church. We are not capable of manufacturing revival. We are not able to rebuild the church. And it's in acknowledging our helplessness that we find ourselves right where God wants us to be. Only the Lord builds his church. Apart from him, we can do nothing. To even think that the power for rebuilding and reconstruction lies in us is to put us at odds with the first of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, Jesus tells us, those who have come to the end of themselves, who cast themselves on the mercy of God and acknowledge they don't have the resources necessary for the work ahead. The truth is, we can't rebuild. Only the Spirit working in us and through us will bring about the renewal of the church. That's why, with Nehemiah, who took a sword and trowel in hand as he rebuilt the wall, we pray along with him his constant refrain, strengthen our hands. That's why, in acknowledging our finitude, we cry out with the psalmist, establish the work of our hands. My hope for this new season of Reconstructing Faith is to take a closer look at how we lean into the Spirit's formation of our hearts and lives, so that we grow in awareness of our need for God's grace, so that we grow in wisdom and how best to meet today's challenges, so that we grow more solid in a world of shadows, so that we run the race to win the prize, knowing it is the Spirit who breathes into our lungs and gives us spiritual life and energy. This is our time.
The idols of the culture are falling over.
This is Mark Sayers again, answering my question about the opportunity we have in this moment.
Conversion often happens when people are in the gap between idols. So when one idol falls over, there's an evangelistic moment, but that is happening en masse. So part of that legitimacy crisis is also a opportunity for the gospel, and we're seeing that. That's playing out. That's not just an intellectual thing. Often we'd have people rock into church, and you might have a few a year who come in and are not Christians and inquiring. In Australia, we are just seeing every week non-Christians turn up. Hindus, Muslims, atheists, agnostics, New Agers, turning up and asking about Jesus. It's profound. And our people are having this all the time. I was just in New Zealand and chatting to a couple who have been going to New Age festivals for a number of years and sort of witnessing and just doing worship in a tent. And they just said the amount of people coming to faith in that community is incredible. What I'm noticing is it's the kind of people, it's the ones doing magic mushrooms, it's the people into the occult, it's the people who are from another faith background, it's the people who are politically different than you think. There's more going on under the surface than we realize. And the weird thing now is the Victorian era didn't talk about sex. What sex was in the Victorian era, now religion is, and Jesus is. Obviously, people are still having sex in the Victorian era because we're here and the generations went on. People are still talking about God. You are seeing this thing in the culture. Some of it's going to be legitimate, some of it's not. Lots of public figures are exploring faith. Dawkins is talking now in the language of being a cultural Christian. Stephen Fry, who was attacking the church, is saying, oh, hang on, there's some elements which are good. So there's this massive cultural move. Some of it is unhealthy. Some of it is moving towards occultism. But spirituality is back big time, and we need to be aware of that. And there is increasing seekers coming. I think the COVID thing, what I noticed it did in Australia, maybe a little bit less so in the US, but I think it's done it in Europe and New Zealand and other places, is a lot of the cultural Christians just didn't come back. So in a sense, people are like, oh, my church is 30% smaller. I've talked to lots of pastors like this. Maybe it's better in the sense that 30% were just there through habit. I hate to say that. Or perhaps they were just there because that's just what you did and they weren't really into it. Maybe COVID created this honest moment. They're like, I don't really believe this. I'm out. And I think it's not the size of the church. Luther talked about the little church in the church is always the redemptive sort of seed in the church. I think we're getting back to that kind of remnant moment. So there's a shaking. I think the judgment of God has come against some things. He's called certain things like no more. I had my digital explanation before about things being called out. I also think maybe God's just like, right, done, church. It's holiness is happening, whether you like it or not. And so I'm seeing a younger generation across denominations who want holiness, are hungry, who are passionate. Is it all going to be Gen Z, Gen Z? No. But is there a remnant in multiple generations who are really hungry? So I am far more in secular Melbourne, Australia. We've had laws passed in my state which would freak Americans out about what we can teach on and stuff like this. But I am more excited and hopeful now because these are the exact moments in church history that God moves, and I'm starting to see it happen.
What kind of people will the Spirit use to rebuild and restore the church in this generation and the next? Not those who consider themselves strong or capable, but those who, knowing their limitations, turn again and again to the limitless power of the Spirit. It will be those who take the long view, who plant seeds in hope, and trust God for the unseen harvest. Those who pour their lives into something that, like trees, will bear fruit long after they're gone. These are the qualities and characteristics we're going to explore this season, essential aspects of spiritual formation, so that we're marked by resilience in leadership, substance in a superficial age, holiness in a world of darkness. True restoration doesn't happen in an instant, and it doesn't happen through our strength. Renewal comes when the Spirit works through humble people who sow, who water, and who wait. This isn't the work of spiritual heroes. It's the work of ordinary disciples becoming day by day pillars of faithfulness in a world of chaos. That's why our hope isn't in what we can accomplish, but in the faithfulness of God, who uses our small acts, our steady witness, to bless the world.
So many years from now, long after we are gone, these trees will spread their branches out and bless the dawn. These trees will spread their branches out and bless someone.
Next time on Reconstructing Faith. What waves have shaped the landscape of evangelicalism? We'll look at 3 of these waves, and a 4th that's beginning to crest.
Most of the things that we take for granted as evangelicals today, such as contemporary music and extemporaneous prayers, are really products of the Pentecostal and charismatic movement adopted through that revival into the broader evangelical movement.
Reconstructing Faith is a podcast powered by the North American Mission Board. In an upcoming episode, we may respond to comments or questions from listeners. You can participate by giving us feedback at resources@nam.net. That's resources@namb.net. If this podcast is helpful to you, it would be helpful to us if you'd leave a 5-star review on whatever platform you're listening to and share it with your friends. If you'd like more resources from me, you can sign up for my email newsletter by checking out the show notes. Reconstructing Faith is written by Trevin Wax. Our show is produced and edited by Scott Slusher. Our sound design is composed, mixed, and mastered by Dan Phelps. Aaron Leslie handles audio editing and engineering. Story editing and consulting is by Amy Patrick. Until next time.